Good afternoon, everybody. I am very proud to be the president and CEO for Women's Center and Shelter of Greater Pittsburgh. My name is Nicole Molinaro, and we are very, very glad that you're here today to discuss an issue that has an unfortunately huge intersection, and those are the issues of domestic violence and gun violence. Please note, this presentation will discuss specific cases of very difficult domestic violence, very traumatizing gun violence. Please know that this may be triggering for some folks, and we just encourage you to take care of yourself and really just do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself during this presentation. So again, we really appreciate you being here today. And we're just going to jump right in. So I have the honor of introducing several of my favorite people, and I really mean that. These are wonderful folks who are going to be presenting to you today. First of all, we have Joy Karg, who is our Training, Mentoring, and Compliance Manager here at Women's Center and Shelter of Greater Pittsburgh. Joy has been the WCNS Training, Mentoring, and Compliance Manager since June 2021. But before that, she served as the Immediate Needs Coordination Program Manager, helping Women's Center and Shelter to meet the emotional, physical, and psychological health and safety needs of survivors who are using our non-resident services, as well as their families' basic needs such as childcare, housing, utilities, food, and more. So we're so happy to have Joy here today as one of our presenters. We also have Matthew Grayson, who's the supervisor of our Homeless Providers Program. Matt joined Women's Center and Shelter as an education facilitator in February of 2021. This year, we are very happy to say he became Women's Center and Shelter's new supervisor of our new Homeless Providers Program, where he consults with and trains Allegheny County adult and youth homeless providers and their staff to enhance their ability to work with families who are experiencing domestic violence and homelessness, and provide direct services to such families who are involved with the homeless system in our region. We are also so happy to have with us today Hadley Haas, who's the local group co-lead for Moms Demand Action, which is one of my absolute favorite groups that exists. Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America is a grassroots organization of volunteers who are dedicated to ending gun violence. Hadley has served as co-lead since December of 2021, and prior to that, she was the group's elections and legislative lead. And last but not least, we have special guest Nicole Vasquez-Schmidt, who is the Assistant United States Attorney from the United States Attorney's Office of the Western District of Pennsylvania. Nicole, that's a mouthful. And Nicole has joined us today to talk a bit about federal gun laws. So we're so happy to have all of them here with us today, some real experts in the field. Now, we have time scheduled for questions and answers at the end of the presentation, but please feel free to ask questions in the chat throughout the presentation. We'll take the most commonly asked questions and pose them to our panel during the Q&A. Please know you can also message Kristen Brown or Emily Moorhead privately to ask your questions if you don't want to ask them publicly. So with all of that said, Hadley, take it away.
Thank you so much, Nicole. It's really my honor to be here and talk about this really important issue facing our country, our state, and our community. I'm going to start by setting it up with some high-level information about gun violence in Pennsylvania and in Allegheny County. Starting at the state level, in an average year, we see 1,628 people die by guns in Pennsylvania. With 12.4 deaths per 100,000 people, Pennsylvania has the 31st highest rate. So we're kind of solidly in the middle. We don't have it the worst, but we're certainly not the best. The rate of gun deaths has increased 23% in Pennsylvania from 2011 to 2020, and that's compared with a 33% increase nationwide. Over this time period, suicides have been about flat. They've decreased by 1% here in Pennsylvania, but the gun homicide rate has increased 60%. So we're just seeing a terrible increase in gun deaths in our state. Looking at domestic violence homicides in Pennsylvania, there have been 112 victim deaths in 2021. 56 of those were killed by a former or current intimate partner, and 63% were with a firearm. So what we see in suicides and domestic violence is the presence of a firearm makes those situations much more lethal. Here in Allegheny County, the rate of gun homicides was relatively flat for a number of years. We went into hiding in 2019 and it dipped a bit, but it has rebounded and unfortunately rebounded with a vengeance. 97 gun homicides in 2020 and 104 in 2021. So far in 2022, when I created this slide on September 26th, there were 79 gun homicides in Allegheny County. I just checked before the call and we're up to 83. So we are tracking to be right around that 104 number again in 2022. In Allegheny County, Black men are disproportionately affected by gun homicide. They comprise 71% of the gun deaths so far this year. And I don't think this map is going to surprise anybody who's been paying attention to the local news here, but homicides in Allegheny County are concentrated in a handful of high-need communities of color. So we see McKees Rocks, the North Side, Homewood and Wilkinsburg, South Pittsburgh, Knoxville, Mount Oliver, Braddock, and down to McKeesport. There are some fantastic partner organizations that we work with through Moms Demand Action who are doing amazing work in those communities. There are organizations like the South Pittsburgh Coalition for Peace, the Hoop Alliance in Braddock, the Wilkinsburg Sanctuary Project for Peace, the Neighborhood Resilience Project. They're doing really good work with violence intervention. And one encouraging thing is that we have seen more funding allocated to groups like that through federal, state, and local budgets. With that, I will turn it over to Joy.
Thanks, Hadley. So as a really quick review, we just wanted to take a few moments and talk about intimate partner violence, domestic violence, how prevalent it is, some of the dynamics and some of the warning signs. So we know that millions of Americans every year report some type of intimate partner violence, whether that's physical, sexual, emotional abuse, or stalking. We also know from the research that while both men and women experience intimate partner violence, women are much more likely to be killed by their abusive partner, particularly so if that partner is male. I also think it's noteworthy here just to say that a lot of this research doesn't really dive into or seemingly represent any people who identify as non-binary or outside of our binary gender system. So as we look at how IPV can impact survivors differently, it's really important to take a look at the increased lethality and a lack of access to resources that different groups might have. So with pregnant women, some of the research shows that anywhere from 3 to 9% of pregnant women can experience abuse during their pregnancy. That number can be up to 50% when we look at low-income single mothers. And for most survivors who are pregnant, the abuse remains constant throughout their pregnancy. So one study for young racial and ethnic minority women found that nearly 45% of Black women experience some type of abuse. I found an absolute flying statistic from the CDC that Black women in the age groups of 25 to 29 are 11 more likely than their white counterparts in that age group to be murdered while pregnant or in their first year after childbirth. For people with disabilities, women who have a disability are significantly more likely to report experiencing some type of sexual violence, physical violence, stalking, physical aggression, or control of reproductive or sexual health by an intimate partner. And when we look at LGBTQ plus folks, the statistics are incredibly high. We have 44% of lesbian women and 61% of bisexual women reporting some type of physical violence or intimate partner violence in their lifetime. 26% of gay men have reported that and 37% of bisexual men. So you can see absolutely this is something that is prevalent in every community, no matter your identities or anything like that. So when we work with survivors and we're screening for potential lethality, we want to make sure that we look just beyond the physical abuse. We can look for threats to harm a survivor, family, pets, or themselves. And having stalking or extreme jealousy can absolutely be a warning sign of potential lethality. When we look at either victims or attempted homicide victims, there's a lot of similarities between them, including extreme jealousy and stalking, following, maybe their abusive partner follows them everywhere they go. Maybe they do really unsettling things to the survivor to let them know that they're being followed. There's usually strangulation or attempts at strangulation, and forced sex. Many abusers view the survivor as their property, and therefore sex is owed to them upon demand, not with consent. And now I'm going to pass it over to Matt.
Thanks, Joy. I appreciate it. Thank you all for having me talk about this. This is very near and dear to my heart. So excuse my enthusiasm or me being excited when I talk about this, not necessarily in a good way, but this is something that is very, very serious, and our work within this is what we combat with. So as I speak, put yourself in a victim's point of view. Put yourself in their shoes as we run through these statistics, and just think about the victim's mindset and what they go through on a daily basis, and understand that a lot of these numbers is what's reported, and a lot of this goes on unreported. So, as I go on, the analysis found that women who are threatened or assaulted with a gun were 20 times more likely to be murdered than women who were not threatened or assaulted with a deadly weapon. Women who were threatened with murder by an intimate partner were 15 times more likely to be killed than other women. Okay. While a gun in the home puts everyone in the home at risk or injury, the risk was especially great for the abused women living in a home with a gun. And as we talk about this, understand the climate in our society where we're at today, where it's being pushed, or we see a lot of it, guns are everywhere. You better get a gun to protect yourself. Well, what about the women that are going through domestic violence or being threatened? People with, just having guns in the house. So, an abused woman who lived in a home with a gun was 6 times more likely to be killed than other women. All right, as we go on, I want you to read this and let this sink in. All right, nearly half of all women murdered in the United States are killed by a current or former intimate partner. And more than half of these intimate partner homicides are by firearm. So half of females that are killed in the United States are by an intimate partner. And then half of those that are killed are killed by intimate partners that have firearms. Okay, so let that sink in. If you don't think this is a problem, let the numbers describe this. Women are 5 times more likely to be murdered by an abusive partner when the abuser has access to a gun. Not necessarily have it, but has access to a gun. More than 1 in 4 homicides in the US are related to domestic violence. And the use of firearms in DV situations increase the risk that there will be multiple fatalities. And as I talk about this, you understand when we say women are 5 times more likely to be murdered, some of us may question, hey, why don't they just leave if there's a gun? Well, think about their state of mind. They're scared. They may be like, well, if I'm around the abuser, then I know where they're at. Okay. If they totally leave, you never know where the abuser where their abuser, a person that uses abuse against them, may show up. So it like these stats, if you just read them, okay, yeah, they're bad. But if you put yourself in the situation, then it makes it that much more, you feel like, hey, we got to do something. We'll move on, Jake. So I want to talk about this. Intimate partners homicide events often result in multiple victims. As we go on, Hadley will talk about mass shootings, and you'll understand the link between domestic violence and mass shootings. But additionally, it is not uncommon for the perpetrator of the intimate partner homicide to die by suicide. Even when a weapon is not discharged, abusers often use the mere presence of gun to coerce, threaten, or terrorize their victims. And the definition of domestic violence is the pattern of coercive behaviors to gain power and control. All right. So these abusers are just by the mere fact of having a gun is using power and control over their victim. Abusers' previous threats with a weapon and threats to kill their partners are both predictors of intimate partner homicide. And before I move on, just think about this again, psychological damage. And you hear stories, again, Hadley will go over some stories how gun violence links to mass shooting. So I'll turn it over to Hadley. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. So each mass shooting sends shockwaves of pain and harm through families, communities, and the nation. And the United States is not the only country with mental illness, domestic violence, or hate-fueled ideologies, but our gun homicide rate is 26 times that of other high-income countries. The difference is easy access to guns. And this connection is not just theoretical. States with weaker gun laws and higher gun ownership rates have higher rates of mass shootings. Every Town for Gun Safety, the parent organization of Moms Demand Action, has done extensive research on mass shootings, and they define them as incidents with 4 or more victims, not including the shooter. The research shows that these mass shooting incidents are often preventable, though we don't need to accept them as an inevitable part of American life. And that's because often the shooter is someone who was legally prohibited from possessing a firearm. Often it's perpetrated by someone who's displayed prior warning signs. Often it's intermingled, as Matt said, with acts of domestic violence. And these incidents are far deadlier when they involve assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. So the archetypal mass shootings occur in a public place like a school or a bar. That's what people often think of when we hear about mass shootings. And those seem to, receive more media attention, but the majority of mass shootings actually occur in private homes. The research that Everytown did looked at shootings between 2009 and 2020. And during that time, 61% of mass shootings occurred entirely in the home. 9% were partially in the home and partially in a public space, and 30% occurred entirely in a public space, like a school, a mall, or a bar. Of those 30%, 11% were in a school, and 59% were in a place of business, such as a restaurant or store. Public mass shootings, though, were deadlier. So 39% of mass shootings occurred at least in part in public, but of those, 51% of all mass shooting deaths occurred in that 39% of mass shootings. So 1 in 3 mass shootings involved a shooter who was legally prohibited from possessing a firearm. In the absence of comprehensive federal law that requires background checks on all gun sales across the country, criminals, domestic abusers, and other prohibited people can easily avoid background checks in 29 states simply by buying guns from unlicensed sellers, including strangers they meet online. So steps like tightening background checks, closing loopholes, and enacting safe storage laws can prevent people from accessing firearms. The perpetrators of mass shootings often display warning signs, and Matt referenced this earlier. They can be things like violence or violating a protection order. And this is evidence that things like extreme risk protection orders or red flag laws can help prevent mass shootings. In 56% of the mass shootings in the analysis by every town, the shooter exhibited at least one dangerous warning sign. We can go to the next slide. And although many people think of mass shootings as random acts of violence, this analysis shows that most shootings are not at all random. In at least 53% of the mass shootings between 2009 and 2020, the perpetrator shot a current or former intimate partner or family member during their rampage. These domestic violence related mass shootings resulted in at least 632 people shot and killed and 106 people wounded, amounting to almost half of the mass shooting deaths and 1 in 10 injuries. And too often, children and teens are the victims of domestic violence mass shootings. Of the 362 children and teens killed in all mass shootings in the past 12 years, nearly 3 of 4, or 72%, died in an incident connected to intimate partner or family violence. And when assault weapons or high-capacity magazines were used in mass shootings, they resulted in far more deaths and injuries. Between 2009 and 2020, the 5 deadliest mass shootings in the US all involved assault weapons or high-capacity magazines. And what's not shown on the screen here is, what's we hold in our hearts here in Pittsburgh, the Tree of Life shooting in Squirrel Hill, where 11 lives were taken by a hate-filled man with an AR-15. We also see that assault weapons and high-capacity magazines were disproportionately used in public mass shootings versus those in private homes. 76% that involved an assault weapon or high-capacity magazine occurred in a public mass shooting. Okay, back to Matt.
Thanks, Hadley. Yeah, also remember, what Hadley just talked about, those are the high, deadly, mass shootings. But understand, a mass shooting is considered 4 more people, okay? So a lot of mass shootings may not get the media coverage as the big ones, but understand that those alone. So just a quick story of what happened in 2008 with Jennifer Hudson. I don't know if all of you know her. She's, a singer from American Idol, I think, or the winner from American Idol. But her brother-in-law shot into her mother's house, shot and killed her mother, her brother, and then took his 7-year-old son and shot him twice in the head because he saw it. So, that is what we're talking about, not necessarily the huge numbers, and that's important, but understand that there's a lot of, domestic violence, mass shootings that don't, that maybe aren't covered as much as the big ones. But understand, all you have to do is just Google DV and mass shootings, and you will see all of them come up on the links. So as we go through this, the research has found that more than 2/3, almost 70% of mass shootings from 2014, 2019, the perpetrator either killed family or intimate partners. The shooter had a history of domestic violence, and that DV-related mass shooting was associated with a greater fatality rate. All right. On average, only 1 in 6 people survive a DV-related mass shooting, compared to 1 in 3 people of non-DV mass shootings. So, and when we hear about DV mass shootings and stuff on the news, the numbers point, you can probably say there's probably some domestic violence IPV situations with that. Go to the next one, Jake. People, the numbers don't lie, and here it is, okay? This is just what it is, and it's very disheartening, and this is why we're doing this to bring awareness and to make some change. But after the most horrific mass shootings, a shooter's violent history with women often shows up as a biographical footnote. So here's one. After Omar Mateen killed 49 people in the nightclub in Orlando, after the news reports that he had beat and strangled his ex-wife throughout the marriage. Okay. Elliot Rodger drove around college town shooting people in 2014 after writing a 140-page manifesto, which he described, where all women would be quarantined in concentration camps and starved to death. So you can see the link coming through. And again, you look at the stats on the side, 15% committed by domestic abusers. This graph shows the deadlier the shooter, the more likely the gunman had a history of domestic violence. So 6 or more plus, 70% of these shootings, the shooter had domestic violence or IPV situations. So what I do, I teach people. I teach providers to listen to just cues or signs. As Joy pointed out earlier, it's just listen to what people have to say, and then you can gain warning signs on top of that. Okay, so the warning sign there, you just have to listen to them. Thanks, Jake. The vast majority of offenders are men. Okay, and when we think about that, of course, the media is going to put on or show men. Well, that's what the numbers say, but that's not true in all cases. Women carried out less than 3% of mass shootings over the 6-year period. Some acted with their male partners, like a couple that murdered 16 people and injured 22 in St. Bernardino in 2015. On the rare occasion that the women acted alone, she had often been the victim of abuse. Okay, where this Michelle Field shot her daughter, 2 grandchildren, and herself in 2018 to free them from their daughter's abusive boyfriend. All right, imagine that. Imagine having that state of mind. Okay, the most frequent cause of female homicide in the workplace after criminally related circumstances such as robbery. Homicide perpetrated by an intimate partner or relative. Between 2011 and 2016 of non-robbery related firearm deaths in the workplace, 76% were female workers killed in circumstances of personal conflict. Of the 90% are killed by domestic violence. All right. And if you just let that sit in, we need to have more of these, basically. We need to be more aware. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt. So now we're going to take a little bit of time and review some common sense gun laws, including Act 79 and the dating partner loophole. And then Nicole's going to talk about federal gun charges, which is going to be very exciting to hear about. So with Act 79, there's a lot of really interesting additions that went into place with this. Back when it was passed in 2019. Prior to 2019, only the survivors who had requested to remove the abusive partner's weapons in a final protection from abuse order would have that request granted. So this could be really tricky for survivors, and that they might have not always been aware if their abuser had a gun. Maybe the abuser had verbally threatened to get one, but the survivor wasn't aware that the abuser actually purchased one. Now, through this law, all final protection abuse orders in the Commonwealth require that all weapons are relinquished by the defendant. Prior to 2019, abusive partners could turn in their weapons to family or friends. And this was not something that the survivor had any say in this process. Understandably so, many survivors were really deeply concerned by the abuser relinquishing their weapons to family and or friends, that the abuser would still be able to really easily access their weapons. Now, family and friends thankfully no longer qualify as safekeepers for the abuser's weapons. The abuser is required to turn in the weapons to either their attorney, an armory, or an appropriate law enforcement agency. Hopefully, survivors are able to feel safer with the knowledge that the abusive partner will not be able to as easily access their weapons as they were before. After the final protection from abuse order expires, abusive partners may request the return of their weapons, which I believe the vast majority will do. I understand guns are quite expensive. Now survivors must be notified of this request so they can safety plan as necessary. Another protection that was added for survivors is that law enforcement can accompany the survivor in serving the protection from abuse order. And when we work with survivors, we really strongly encourage them to have a third party serve the protection from abuse order and really to circumvent any potential violence from the abuser. But having law enforcement present can provide additional safety for survivors in this critical step of the PFA process. Additional protections for survivors can include requesting the extension of a protection from abuse order where the abusive partner is said to be released from incarceration within 90 days of their anticipated release without having to prove new incidences of abuse. I worked with a survivor who was filing a PFA against her abuser who was said to be released from custody shortly. During the sentencing hearing, the abuser looked right at the survivor and said, "I'm going to kill you as soon as I'm released from jail." So the survivor wanted this protection from abuse order in place, and the judge denied the order, saying perhaps the abusive partner had changed during their incarceration. This was prior to 2019, but thankfully this new law provides this important protection for survivors so they don't have to go through the enhanced legal process that survivor went to finally get the protection that she needed. The period to relinquish firearms has changed as well. So prior to 2019, abusers had 60 days to relinquish their firearms. And this was challenging, I would say, not only for survivors, but us as advocates. Safety planning with somebody for 24 hours is a lot easier than safety planning for 60 days. So now they have only 24 hours to relinquish their firearms. And in those 24 hours, we can help survivors safety plan for themselves and their children. Maybe that includes going to a family or friend's house where the abuser wouldn't suspect. Maybe they're able to come into our shelter services during that time period. But the 24 hours made a huge difference for survivor safety in this time period. Another change that was enacted is that all final protection from abuse orders, whether they were agreed to upon by consent or by order, so whether the defendant showed up and agreed to it or if they didn't show, they became strong enough to prevent abusive partners from purchasing new firearms during the duration of PFA, even if there wasn't an initial weapons relinquishment included with that. So that allowed survivors to have a little bit of safety of mind and knowing that abusers were not able to go out and purchase new weapons during this time. Legally, I should add, of course, is always the little tough modifier with that. So dating partner loophole, you probably have heard this referred to as the boyfriend loophole, but we're trying to be more inclusive here with the term dating partner. And the issue at play here is really how intimate partner violence relationships are defined really at the federal level. So at the federal level, it's two people who are or were married, live together as a couple, or have a child together. And this is an issue because it really leaves out people who are dating but do not meet these categories. I think there's a lot of interesting statistics about younger people who are not moving in together but still staying at home with their families, so they would not be covered under this. This is also an issue because the abusive partner would be exempt from some of these laws as we look at misdemeanor domestic violence charges. So charges like simple assault, terrorist threats, recklessly endangering another person, those are all usually misdemeanor level domestic violence charges depending on the case. So the recent gun legislation that was passed did work to partially close this loophole, but as you'll see, there are still some gaps here in our beautiful Commonwealth. 29 states, and Hadley was talking about this earlier, I believe have worked to close or partially close this loophole. So in PA, what we have is that abusive partners were the final PFA against them, regardless of that relationship, even if were simply dating, they're prohibited from possessing or acquiring firearms. But those who have been convicted of those misdemeanor IPV level charges, like I mentioned, are not prohibited from possessing or acquiring firearms during this time. So that's really a huge loophole that we have where a lot of people, a lot of survivors are not getting the protection that they need during that time. I'm going to now pass it off to Nicole to talk about federal gun charges.
Thank you so much, Joy. Thank you for having me here today. As Nicole mentioned, my name is Nicole Vasquez Schmidt. I'm an assistant United States attorney in the Western District of PA. Forgive my Department of Justice halo. I use it for court proceedings, and I had one right before this and didn't switch it. Sometimes I find it looks a little funny on trainings, but I have the honor, I would say, of being my office's domestic violence coordinator. So my office covers all of Western District of PA. So that's Pittsburgh, obviously, but also up to Erie, down through Somerset. And, I consider my role honestly like a huge task, right? We have 25 counties in the Western District of PA. Intimate partner violence is a huge issue in all of those counties. And I've really been charged by the U.S. Attorney to increase our prosecutions in this space and to provide as much support in this space as we can. So gun laws are a huge way where we can bring federal resources to bear. So similar to under the state laws, right? It's a federal crime to possess a firearm. Something that's interesting in federal laws, it's also a federal crime to possess ammunition, not just the guns. So under federal law, it's a crime to possess a firearm or ammunition while subject to a qualifying protection order. And in Pennsylvania, that means a final PFA. Unfortunately, a temporary PFA just won't count. So I would really encourage, get your clients to the final PFA stage, because the federal laws will kick in at that point. And that law, the law prohibiting the possession of the firearm and ammunition while subject to a qualifying PFA, that traces its origins back to 1994. I believe Bill Clinton signed that into law in the crime bill, I think it was called, in 1994. And, I've read some of the legislative history around it, and it's very interesting. The sponsors of the bill really stressed the great dangers by firearms in the hands of domestic abusers. And Congress at that time really wanted the federal law to support the state laws and to ensure that people who are subject to the qualifying orders, that they can't have access to guns. And frankly, I think prosecutors, some of us, it's no one's fault, but I think it's an underutilized prosecution, honestly, because I think we prosecute a lot of felons who have guns, and that's great. But what if you have someone who's not a felon but has a final PFA? We can also prosecute them, and they're subject to the same penalties. And so I think it's really important. We've been really working to increase our prosecutions of that crime. And it's helpful because a victim's testimony isn't sometimes necessary. I had a case where I charged this recently, where the defendant had no criminal history. He was a veteran, but he was a domestic abuser, and there was an intimate partner violence incident. There was a gun discovered. We charged him. We worked with the ATF to adopt, and the DA's office to adopt the charges. He ended up getting 15 months incarceration, which is fairly high given that he had no criminal history. And then he'll be subject to 3 years of supervised release when he gets out, and he's still in. And obviously we knew that he's getting out at some point, but it really was helpful to the victim. And she never ever had to appear at one court proceeding. She was able to provide a victim impact statement at sentencing, but without ever having to even step foot in the courtroom or on a Zoom, and whatever she didn't feel comfortable with. So that's one of the federal laws relating to intimate partner violence. Unfortunately, with that one, the loophole, the dating, I like that. I'll switch. I usually say boyfriend loophole, but I will try to switch that. The dating partner loophole still exists, unfortunately, in that federal law. It only applies to, I'm looking at the definition, former spouses, current and former cohabitants, or people who have a child in common. So that loophole still exists there. But they did close the loophole just recently in June, as Joy was mentioning, for another federal law, which makes it a crime to possess a firearm or ammunition after a conviction of a qualifying misdemeanor crime of domestic violence. So here, mainly in Pennsylvania, that's the simple assault crimes. And so that now applies to people convicted of violence with dating relationships is the new term. So we have that crime. And then I mentioned already, we can prosecute those who have been convicted of a felony, or under Pennsylvania law, a first-degree misdemeanor, which is punishable by 2 to 5 years in prison. So those individuals are also subject to federal laws. we have a lot of other federal laws that we work to apply in the intimate partner violence space, cyber stalking. I mean, you mentioned some things about threats. I have a cyber stalking case where we weren't able to charge the illegal firearms possession, but it did involve a short, kind of threats like, I'm going to come get this gun, and so and we were able to charge that individual with federal cyber stalking. So we do have a lot of resources to bring to bear, and I feel very passionate about this, and I do believe that federal prosecutors should should use these statutes more often to prosecute people who have guns and who have PFAs and who have the qualifying crimes. Especially in the Western District of PA, guns are everywhere in the Western District. So I think to deter individuals from possessing guns, the individuals who qualify under these crimes is so important. And if you ever have a incident that you think would rise to the level of federal prosecution, I will put my information in the chat. Feel free to call me or email me anytime. I'm happy to talk about these laws. And as I said, I'm very passionate about it. So, and happy to look into any potential cases that my office could bring. I think going back to Hadley.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. Thank you for your passion and for all the work that you're doing. Really glad to have you in that role. So thanks for being here today too. We're going to switch gears and talk about the impact of gun violence, starting with mass shootings. So from a mass shooting perspective, the impact of gun violence extends far beyond those who are immediately affected. Studies show that there have been impacts like post-traumatic stress and depression that extend beyond the immediate communities, even to those living far away. After Sandy Hook and Parkland and Uvalde, children, especially those with existing anxiety, had difficulty returning to school. Parents struggle to put their kids on buses. I know I've seen fear in the eyes of so many mothers when they talk about school shootings and worrying about that, and the impact of those incidents are really far-reaching. I was struck even just yesterday. I was talking to a close friend whose daughter refused to go with her family to Kennywood because of the recent shooting there just a couple of weeks ago. So that's painted this place that her family was going to go for a fun Halloween event and outing, and because of her increased anxiety of something that didn't even directly affect her, she missed out on that opportunity. And I continue to encounter community members who were affected by the massacre at Tree of Life. It's the trauma, we talk about these things in terms of the immediate victims, people who were killed, people who were injured, but the trauma extends far beyond those immediately impacted. Back to Joy.
Thanks, Hadley. This is a perfect piggyback off of you. We're going to talk about trauma and how survivors of gun violence really rank their experience as very highly traumatic. So if we think about trauma in a very basic definition of too much, too soon, too fast, that absolutely makes sense that many of them would experience high levels of trauma and say that this is the most traumatic thing that they've ever experienced. We can also see that when more than half of all survivors have experienced gun violence in a home, theirs, of family members and neighbors or friends, this can make that healing process even more difficult for survivors. We usually think about our homes as our respites, and that can completely take that away from them and leave them to feel like there's nowhere that is a safe place for them. We also see that this trauma impacts not only the survivors, but the people who are that are directly helping them as well. Nurses and doctors say that trauma from gun violence is not one of the most challenging things that they have to encounter. Also, school staff who maybe are working with a family who is impacted by gun violence. When we see some of these statistics, it's also really important to think about the needs that survivors have after they experience gun violence. 2 out of 3 have a need for mental health services because, again, if we think about trauma as a too much, too soon, too fast, they would absolutely need a very skilled professional to help them navigate this really complicated experience. 1 out of 3 knows the need for legal assistance. It can be a very complicated process, even just to go to court for jury duty, but let alone you're a victim in a criminal case. One of the great things that Women's Center does is have an advocate accompany them through that process and provide information and advocacy through that. 40% of survivors noted the need for financial assistance to recover from their gun violence. And the good news is that there's actually assistance out there through Victims Compensation Act. I always think about this one client example, Nicole Molinaro might remember this, where there was a survivor that I was working with who was shot by her partner. She was in the hospital and her electricity was shut off, and then when calling the electric company and trying to work with them, and I said, she was shot by her intimate partner, they basically said, well, we don't care, that doesn't impact her ability to pay a bill. And it most certainly does impact survivors' ability to pay those bills, hospital bills. They have lost wages, surgical costs. There's a lot of financial assistance that survivors need. Then again, we're seeing that gun violence causes survivors high levels of psychological distress. And in the case of intimate partner violence, like we've been talking about, this makes perfect sense. This is someone who claimed to love them, who attempted this extreme act of violence against them. We also know that losing a loved one to gun violence can lead to high levels of post-traumatic stress disorder for family members and friends of the victims. And I can say I've only worked with a handful of gunshot survivors, thankfully, I'm knocking on wood. But for many of them, it's a very long road to physical recovery, emotional recovery, financial recovery as well. And this is really just a small snippet of the impact that gun violence has, not only on survivors, those who are directly impacted, family, friends, but our society as well.
All right, thank you all so much. That was just such difficult but important and very well presented information. So we are so thankful, Joy, Matt, Hadley, Nicole. Thank you all so much. Just an incredible amount of information and so difficult to deliver. But thank you all so much for doing that because it's intensely important. And unfortunately, it becomes more and more important, with really every passing day. So we are ready for questions. So we really want to kind of open up the floor. I know Kristen may jump in with any questions that we've received in the chat. One question in advance of getting that I wanted to address is, we feel it's very, very important to be very forthright with this information, as you just saw, right? And so one of the facts of what's going on is the increase in gun violence and injury for women of color and for other marginalized groups that was mentioned. What I wanted to put out there, and if you were on our Lunch and Learn last year around domestic violence and racism, you will have heard basically a whole presentation of this. So I won't go too deeply into it because literally I could talk for hours about this. But what I wanted to say is we don't see that increase in violence because men of color or other marginalized groups are more violent. We see it because of the systemic racism, because of the other systemic biases that make it harder for those experiencing domestic violence who are dating or married to somebody who's a person of color, who's of another marginalized group. It makes it much more difficult for them to reach out for help a lot of times earlier on. And this ends up being the result sometimes. So I just wanted to kind of get that out there because it's important to know that this happens, that this is absolutely accurate information, and also that it's not that it's society basically in our systemic structures that have been set up over hundreds of years that really are the root of that. So I'm not sure if I said that very eloquently, but hopefully you all understand what we're saying. So with that said, Kristen, do we have questions from the chat that we want to open up, or do we want to open up the floor to questions?
Yeah, and so just one question, and then we can open up the floor. We didn't get any questions from the chat, but I know one thing that we were hoping to get an answer. Just, what can people do to affect legislation in PA? I know we touched on that a little bit, but it's probably, on the minds of people after getting all of this sort of really heavy information and all of these statistics.
Absolutely. Hadley, do you want to take that one?
Sure, I can take that one. I mean, I think anytime, certainly from a Moms Demand Action perspective, we try to rally our volunteers anytime there is good legislation that is proposed, that we reach out to our legislators and ask them to support it, or when there is bad legislation that is being proposed, that we ask volunteers to call legislators to ask them to vote against that legislation. And at a state level, that's what we've seen more of late. So I think, we're coming up on election season, and I think it's really important that we send leaders to Harrisburg and to Washington, D.C. who prioritize gun safety. And so we do have a website, it's gunsensevoter.org, where you can pull up your address and it will show you can vote for, who advocate and lead with gun safety in mind. We're doing a number of different activities to support those candidates because we feel like the most important thing, especially in the current landscape here in Pennsylvania, that we can do from a legislative standpoint is change the legislators and get legislators in there who will fight for this.
Right. Hadley, thank you so much. Women's Center and Shelter has been very proud to work with Moms Demand Action, Everytown, Ceasefire, the organizations that all work together to really influence legislation. And I'll tell you, they're absolutely incredible organizations that do amazing work and do so just consistently and kind of against the odds. So thank you for the successes and for all the work that you've done that be successes in the future, but not yet yielded that.
I hope. Thank you.
Right. Yeah. Fingers crossed, knocking wood. We're all very superstitious here. Yeah. Okay. Lauren asked, how do cases get referred to the DOJ? Should clients be encouraged to reach out to Nicole's office directly? Does local law enforcement need to investigate and then refer the case? Great question, Laura. I will send that to Nicole, the other Nicole.
Yes. Yes, you can reach out directly to my office, directly to me. That's why I've been named the domestic violence coordinator. And then oftentimes what will happen is, well, certainly we do get referrals from local law enforcement, but you can also reach out directly. And sometimes what will happen is, unfortunately, I'll say doesn't look like we have a federal crime here, but here's some more resources or what we can do. But if it does seem like it's going to potentially be a federal crime, I'll just get an agent, assigned, and we'll work with an agent from usually the FBI is who I usually go to, depending on the ATF if it's a gun case. And I'll just get an agent, and then that agent will conduct the investigation from there, and then kind of loop me back in if there's a chart, when it's time to make a charging decision. But you can absolutely reach out to me in the first instance.
Nicole, thank you. I'm going to ask a follow-up question to that.
Sure.
And this is a little bit sensitive, but all of this information is, if the local law enforcement are discouraging the person to reach out to your office, what do you say to that? What do you recommend they do?
They should still call, and I'm, there's sometimes, we have victim coordinators. I forget their exact title. I feel like they changed the title a lot, but Adrian Howe and Molly Williams, who is they're both wonderful. Mm-hmm. And they work in my office to work directly with victims. So I usually loop them in right away as well. But absolutely, I have had cases, and I love the local law enforcement, so I'm not putting down anyone, but
right.
I have had cases where local law enforcement did not choose to bring charges, and I ended up bringing a charge. So that should not be a bar to someone contacting us for help.
Great, thank you so much. What other questions do we have? Sasha, your hand's up. Go for it.
So when I
when I think of this, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but when I think of this issue, I think of it as an interplay of gun availability, toxic masculinity, and then race as modeled upon the different forms of masculinity, but the white toxic masculinity that is shaping this. And when I think about the most well-known cases of mass shootings, we said 90% of mass shootings were committed by males. But if I think about cases of most well-known mass shootings, I can think of maybe one or two that were not committed by white males. Mm-hmm. So can you maybe talk about how race comes into play when we look at the larger picture, because I don't have that statistics, and whether I'm wrong when I think about mass shootings being committed mostly by white males, whether I'm off base there?
Sasha, thank you so much for that question. That's a great question. And I think when we're talking about mass shootings that are, so I should just defer this to Hadley, but I'm going to give it a go. I think that for mass shootings that are perpetrated by, that are not domestic violence driven, it is primarily white males. I agree very much overall with your toxic masculinity statement. But Hadley, can you actually add some factual information into my answer?
And I can follow up with some additional information as well, but I do, we are seeing an increase of hate-filled mass shootings. So whether that be hate towards women, hate towards racial or ethnic groups, there is an increase in that. And certainly your point about the intersection of hate with accessibility to guns is where we see that reach, a crisis point. And like I said previously, what's different here in this country is the access to guns, right. Not the hate or the domestic violence or the other things. So certainly there's work to be done, on all aspects of that. From my perspective, we're most focused on trying to ensure gun safety and responsible gun ownership and enacting common sense gun legislation. And, things like potentially an assault weapons ban or things of that nature as well, that when there is this type of hate-filled shooter, that they aren't able to, have the same impact that they can with these weapons of war.
Right. Thank you so much, Hadley. I'm noticing the time and noticing we only have about 2 minutes left. So we're going to just zoom through our last few slides. We wanted to say thank you so much to our partners that you've heard from today, Moms Demand Action and the Office of the United States Attorney General of the Western District. I'd also like to add to that, we have many partners on the call, including, I don't mean to call you out, but it's a positive call out, Sergeant Mitchell from the City of Pittsburgh Police Domestic Violence Unit. Who we are honored to work with literally day in and day out doing this work. So thank you to all of our partners, those I mentioned, those I didn't. And if you want to get ready, if you want to get involved, Moms Demand Action, which I will tell you is not only for moms, it's for moms and more. Proudly a member for many, many years. Text ready to 644-33 to join Moms Demand Action. And you can see the gunsensevoter.org information about gun safety in the upcoming midterm election. And we of course would be remiss if we did not close with telling you, of course, we are always here for you or any loved one at Women's Center and Shelter. If you are feeling unsafe, if you just need to talk, call our hotline, text us, chat us through our website, wcscanhelp.org, to be connected to an advocate, regardless of where you are in your journey, whether you're just trying to figure out if you are being abused or whether you are literally fleeing for your life, we have people and programs who can help and offer hope. So please reach out to us and please pass the word along. And last but not least, you can find out more about Domestic Violence Awareness Month programming at dvampgh.org. This includes our new advocacy calendar, which gives you actions you can take every day in October, Domestic Violence Awareness Month, to become more informed about domestic violence and support survivors in their journey to safety. So 1 o'clock on the dot. If anybody has any other questions, feel free, please, to stay on. Otherwise, we are wrapping up. We so appreciate everybody coming today. Thank you so much. We hope you all have a wonderful and safe day. Thank you.